Objective 5, demonstrate knowledge of principles and evidence-based instructional practices for promoting academic language development, including vocabulary development. So Objective 5 is going to focus broadly on vocabulary. But let's tie it back to the rope as we do with all of these concepts. So in Objectives 1 through 4, we focused mostly, almost exclusively on word recognition pieces. Now we're going to start to focus and shift, much like a reader does, into more of the language comprehension components. This objective is going to be focused on vocabulary and background knowledge. So let's talk about what each of those are. First, let's start with background knowledge because it's arguably more important, even though it's more important to the success of a reader, even though it's kind of difficult for us to do something about. But let's talk about what it is first. So background knowledge is all of the information and experiences that students are bringing to the table when they read a text, right? So think about an article you've read about a subject you're very interested in, or something that people generally know a lot about. Those individual words in that book, they're all going to have meaning, but the making connections between each of those individual words, you're going to be relying on your background knowledge to understand how those words are related to each other. So for school and for the MTEL, what this means is that background knowledge is really, really important in predicting the success of a student reading a text. The more background knowledge they have prior to reading, the more likely they are to understand what they are reading. Now, this is tricky because background knowledge is very important, but it is very hard for us as teachers to affect. It's very hard for us to give students these huge wealth of experiences and knowledge, and it could be as background knowledge. The building of background knowledge has much more to do with what's happening outside of the classroom than inside of the classroom, right? However, we have developed some recommendations and evidence-based practices to help students try to expand their background knowledge in the confines of the school day. So again, if the goal is to get them to learn as much things as possible, right? Just being exposed to as much information and do what's called wide reading, which is don't focus solely on one subject, read about lots and lots of different things so that it becomes more likely when you encounter a novel text that you're going to be bringing something to the table to help you understand that. If background knowledge is just right, by the way, background knowledge is not about reading and it's not just a count previous books read, it counts all knowledge that the student has, because once the student has the decoding, right, they decode it, then they're going to be searching for meaning, right? They're going to be searching for meaning, and when they're doing that, they're not just thinking about all the books they've read, they're thinking about all of the information that they have available to them. Which is why when you're building background knowledge, we suggest doing things like having students listen to books read aloud to them, um, watching videos, all this multimedia stuff, right? So, listening to somebody read a book to you, is that going to make you a better decoder? No, of course not, right? Um, you're not interacting with text in any way, so how could you possibly get any practice decoding listening to a book? However, it's not useless because it helps the other side. It helps this background piece where you're just trying to get knowledge. Other things we can do explicitly to help teach background knowledge is just make clear to students categories of things, how things relate to each other, um, whether things are similar or opposite, whether they come before or after, whether they're above or below, those sorts of things. And teaching hierarchies, students need to understand how all of that works. So when they come to texts, um, they can bring that to help them understand. This keyword piece is about vocabulary, and we'll get there in a second. Okay, here we are. Vocabulary. Um, Vocabulary is the understanding of individual words and word meanings in both oral and print. So we have both a oral vocabulary that we understand when people speak to us. This is the language comprehension piece, our oral vocabulary, all the things we understand when spoken to, and a print vocabulary, which for our younger students is going to be vastly different, right? Our young students that are just learning to start to decode have substantial oral vocabularies and little or no print vocabulary, right? As we get older, the gap will close because we'll be such if we become proficient readers, we become such strong decoders. Um, then we'll end up having also words in print that we sometimes people have this effect, this sensation where they read a word in print over and over again, and they know what it means from having read it so many times, but they don't recognize it when somebody speaks it because it's pronounced in a way that was unfamiliar to them. So they never heard anybody say it, so they didn't know how it was pronounced. So when somebody says it, they're like, "Oh, it's that word," and they make that connection. I don't know. It'd be something with like bourgeoisie or something, right? You read bourgeoisie over many texts, you have a sense of what it means. But then when somebody says it, you're like, oh, there's a G in there? Like that's, and you kind of, you figure it out. So the point is you have two separate vocabularies, and they are distinct and they can develop independently from each other. Uh, yeah. So vocabulary is the glue that holds stories, ideas, and content together, and it's what makes comprehension accessible. Vocabulary is really the core of the language comprehension piece of the group. Now, while background is more very, very important, you know, of the things that we measure, if I like give a student a bunch of words, and I test how many vocabulary words they know. The size of my estimation of their vocabulary knowledge is quite a powerful predictor of their ability to understand text. So if I test them on these individual words, it's going to make it really likely that they understand the text compared to students that don't have as much vocabulary and are kind of putting the pieces together. So there's a very strong link, and this is important for the test, between vocabulary knowledge and comprehension. They move very tightly together. So how do we want to teach vocabulary? We teach vocabulary intentionally and explicitly. And the word robust gets thrown around. You just hear it. It's become like a meme. Robust vocabulary instruction, which means we want it very clear. We want in lots and lots of words. And we want to just tell students, what does this word mean? When the student doesn't understand a word, I want you to feel the freedom to uh, not have them try to discover or do any sort of guessing. Feel the freedom to explicitly teach what the word is. Okay. So that's what we mean by intentional. We're directly explaining the meanings, and then we're having interactive follow-up so that students get more repetitions with those words. If we're going to distill it down to four critical elements of vocabulary instruction, we would say it's these four things. One, selecting the correct words to teach. Now, this is a tricky, tricky problem, and I'm going to devote a whole section on the next slide to talking just about this. But assuming that you've selected the correct words to teach, the next thing is you have to develop student-friendly definitions for these words. Why? Because if students don't understand your explanation of the word, if you're using like technical definitions, then students aren't going to get any, they don't have anything to attach those definitions to, right? You need to bring the understanding down to the level of the student's background knowledge so that they have something to make that connection to. It's like thinking of it like tying a balloon down, right? If you tie it down and there's no hook there, then the balloon's just going to fly away, and you've wasted the student's time trying to teach them that word. You need to get it to a student-friendly definition so they can make that connection. To help make those more salient, you do this in interesting, challenging, and playful ways. You have students do all sorts of activities, experiencing the word in multiple modalities. Um, and you just want to make it memorable. That's the point, right? The more engaging the experiences with the student, the more memorable the learning of the word will be, right? And especially there's a lots of words that become, especially a lot of science words, they become much easier to teach in terms of demonstration, right? So it's one thing if I tell you what combustion is, and it's another thing if I say what combustion is and then, put two chemicals together in a beaker under a Bunsen burner and they go poof. And everybody goes, oh, combustion, I get it. Um, so that's what we mean by interesting in activities. Um, four, it's hard to devote, teachers are time poor as the saying goes. So it's hard to, your question might be back to me. Well, what do I cut? Yeah, I know. Um, but I would advocate for vocabulary instruction at all times of the day. In my own personal teaching experience, when I work with students, we would try to bring in vocabulary instruction and encourage, we'd have a word and we'd have students try to use that word in all sorts of contexts on the playground, lining up, at lunch, etc. All throughout the day, I am going out of my way to try to shimmy those vocabulary words in to try to give students as many experiences and then positively reinforcing them for also using those words as well. Um, so, I'm not saying that you need to have a line in your schedule that says, vocabulary and do it for 15 minutes a day between blah and blah. Vocabulary just needs to be embedded throughout all subject areas. Vocabulary is knowledge building. And when you are doing instruction, you are trying to do knowledge building. So it happens everywhere across all subjects. We're trying to do knowledge building. Okay. This is answers the question, how do we figure out what words to choose? So Beck and McCowan developed a three-tier system that many folks use to try to figure out um, what words to teach. How do we categorize words so that we know what's worth teaching and what's not worth teaching? And there's a lot of activities and things we can do to help, teachers get really good at this, but you should just have a good idea of what are the words we want to teach. Okay. First, we'll start at the bottom. Tier one, this is the biggest tier because it's the most words. These are the high frequency basic vocabulary words that are familiar to most students. You'll see these in high frequency lists, but it's just the words that appear all the time. And the important thing is they appear across virtually all texts, right? That's a tier one word, words that appear everywhere, and students aren't going to lack opportunities to practice them naturally. We don't want to teach those. They get enough practice with them. We don't really need to explicitly teach them. We can teach decoding irregularities around them if we're doing something like that, but we're not necessarily teaching the definitions of those words because there's just so much um, understanding that the student has from their use. I'm going to jump to the top because this is also another one you don't want to teach, is tier three. Tier three are what are called low frequency domain specific words. So a student might be reading a book about, I don't know, an astronaut. Okay. There's going to be some words in that book about astronauts that are very hyper specific to that book. And they're not going to come up a lot, right? Or this might be, oh, here's a better example. Um, Harry Potter books, okay? Now, there are a lot of words in Harry Potter books that are made up by J.K. Rowling that are like names for spells and stuff that she casts, the wizards cast and whatnot, right? Those are great examples of tier three words because those um, spell names and other words for her magic aren't going to show up in any other books, right? They're very low frequency and they're very domain specific in the sense that they're just restricted to Harry Potter books and that greater world and other books that she's written. Um, right? There's no bang for your buck in explicitly teaching those words because they're not going to translate to other books. Okay. So if you can tell by my description of tier three, that means that tier two is the sweet spot. Tier two is what we want to teach. These are high utility academic vocabulary words that are found across content areas. Okay. These are words that are found across areas, so they're not super specific to a book or a subject area like space. Um, but they're not high frequency. They don't come up enough that students would get a lot of practice with them, right? So these are going to be words um, like an adjective that we might teach a third grader or maybe a little older. It kind of depends on the age when it's tier three versus tier two, right? Would be something like superfluous, right? We might teach superfluous as a tier two word to like upper elementary school kids. Now, superfluous is a rare word. It doesn't get written down a lot. So definitely can't call it high frequency. But it's definitely not domain specific either. We can talk about superfluous across all content areas. So that would be a good example of a tier two word that you might want to teach. And those words are also very likely crucial to understanding the text because authors, when they choose words um, like that, they're going to be essential, right? They're going to be the very important words to understanding what's going on. Otherwise, they would just use a bland high frequency tier one word, or they use a tier three word that is only going to show up a couple times. So what we want to do is find those. Again, there's lots of ways to practice. We could look at a page and pick out tier two words, and that is a great activity, and I'd love to do it, but it's probably not necessary for the MTEL is becoming really skilled at picking out tier two words. But the thing I need you to take away with is that high frequency words and low frequency domain specific words, those are not appropriate to teach. So take this definition. What do we want? The MTEL is not going to call them tier two, but what we want to teach is high utility academic vocabulary that are found across content areas. That's what we want to choose, and that's what the MTEL wants you to know. One thing the MTEL may also bring up is incidental word learning. Now, unfortunately, I've been encouraging you to try to teach vocabulary as much as you can throughout the day, and that's well and good. But you might have also felt like there's a contradiction between what I was saying about background knowledge and vocabulary, because a lot of what students learn and bring to the table happens outside of the classroom. And so it is with vocabulary too, that a large amount of vocabulary that students pick up, especially their oral vocabulary, happens what we would call incidentally, right? Students just are going through the world, looking at signs, hearing people talk to each other, and they make connections. They helplessly make connections between they see the things, they make a connection. They see an exit sign, they know that's the door. Oh, exit must mean that's where you leave. It has something to do with leaving, right? Lots of incidental word learning that students do. Um, and a big obstacle that we face is that our students that have those limited vocabularies, they're often limited not because teachers didn't teach enough vocabulary. There's a limited amount of vocabulary that we're capable of teaching in school. It is that um, it is that they just didn't have enough exposures in their world. Their world was not a meaning-rich environment in which they were able to do a lot of incidental word learning, and that ends up being what's called the vocabulary gap, right? And so this thing happens where, you have a learning-rich environment outside of school, You do a lot of incidental word learning. You're bringing to school a large oral vocabulary and a large amount of background knowledge, which allows you to then learn more once you get to school. Right. So it's just kind of the way that it works is that when you're bringing more to the table, you're going to get more out of each experience. So this is going to create an ever widening gap because the kiddos that don't bring as much background knowledge to a text, they're going to then learn less from it. So we get this diverging path of students know a lot and then they get a lot more, and students that don't know a lot, they benefit from even newer exposures, not as much as the kids that brought a lot to it. So this becomes this vocabulary, this ever-widening vocabulary gap, and this is attributed largely to what's called incidental word learning, which is a thing that will come up in your MTEL. Let's broadly separate how vocabulary development happens early versus, after. So early on, in grades K to 2, pre-K to 2, um, students have a large oral vocabulary so that when books are read to them, even if they can't read them or would find them very challenging to read, they can often understand them when they're being read to. So this is why we encourage read alouds a lot, because even though the students aren't getting practice decoding during a read aloud, they're not getting explicit practice decoding. If they're really following the teacher's finger as they point to each word, they might get a tiny bit of decoding. But mostly the point of that is language development, right? They're hearing, they're knowledge building. Uh, so when you're doing this read aloud, and they're doing this language building, you should be directly teaching, and in the book, an evidence-based practice that will come up in the MTEL is pre-teaching vocabulary prior to reading a story. Um, and, we'll say, according to MTEL, you should do that. You should be taking a couple tier 2 vocabulary words relevant to the book and pre-teaching them prior to reading. Again, in the student-friendly definitions, as we said, again, extending the use to beyond the classroom. You should try to do between 4 and 6 words per sitting, right? If you're going to read a couple pages, if you're with second graders and you're reading a chapter book, or if you're just trying to read one whole picture book, 4 to 6 words per sitting. Gestures are something that helps kids learn new concepts. You can come up with hand movements and signals, and lots of programs add gestures to them. They can help. Beyond second grade, now we're talking about what's called reading for understanding. Pre-K to 2 is called the learn to read phase. Now we're in the read to learn phase, read for understanding. So now things are going to change, and we're going to focus less on lots of explicit decoding practice. Of course, if students need it, you should still give it to them. But largely, we're going to be talking about more meaning, more vocabulary building. So we can talk about dictionary use, and the MTEL might bring up dictionary stuff about, you should know that the MTEL is fine with looking up words on a dictionary. That's a practice that's good for them. So if you see looking a word up in a vocabulary as an option, that don't dismiss that, even if it feels a little old-fashioned. It could be the right answer. Other things that we're going to explicitly teach, and I call these bang for your buck, right? If you go back to that, the objective before when we were talking about morphemes, right? If I give you a base or a root in morpheme and I tell you the meaning of it, that helps you get a lot of understanding. So it becomes, if I'm trying to teach as much vocabulary as possible, it becomes really efficient to teach vocabulary centered around morphemes, because then I'm not just teaching one word at a time. It's like I'm teaching like 20 words, a little bit about 20 words. And that can be a lot more powerful than just do, like, you wouldn't, right? I think in the word matrix from before, it was take, right? You wouldn't want to do take one day and then retake the next day and then intake the next day, and etc. You would just want to teach the morpheme root take and then teach all of the prefixes and suffixes that go around them. And then students can bring all those prefixes and suffixes and roots to make many, many, many words out of those things. We'll also do, teaching of synonyms and Greek and Latin roots and antonyms and all that good stuff as well. All right, let's get into some questions. Here's your first one. You might see this is 95. I'm pulling this from a later objective. Um, because vocabulary and knowledge building gets spread around in a bunch of objectives. But I wanted to put this question here in the vocabulary section. So go ahead and read this. We'll do a knowledge check and we'll come back with the answers. So pause here. The correct answer is C. Introducing a text's key vocabulary and supporting the students in close reading of key passages. So what do we have here? We have students that are able to read the text orally with fluency. So what does that tell us? That tells us they are decoders, right? They can decode everything because they're reading it smoothly and accurately. So they're getting the bottom part of the rope. What they're not getting is the language comprehension part of the rope, the top part. So they don't understand what's going on. The kid flies through it, and then what did you read? I have no idea. Okay. So how do we help a kiddo doing that stuff? So what we want to do is we want to take the thing that is going to help understanding the most. And the thing that helps understanding the most is explicit vocabulary instruction. So we're going to take the words that the student didn't understand and explicitly teach those words to that student. And then we're going to do it's a closer reading where we slow down and we look at it, the text carefully. And we're going to work with them to make those connections and make them clearly for them. This has nothing to do with narrative or informational texts. That doesn't, that's not connected to this question. And I just want to be, this is a little tough because I've told you in the past that I put this question in here on purpose, that explicit instruction is good, and that should be a clue that you're looking at a correct answer. However, here is an example of where explicit instruction is tricking you because, yes, while we want to see explicit instruction, but it has to be in the thing that we care about. And do we want to teach appropriate test taking strategies? Is that going to help the student? No, we don't teach grade level appropriate test taking strategies. Certainly not to help them with their language comprehension and therefore their reading. That's test taking strategies, not going to help reading. So this is a case where I'm pointing out explicit instruction is in fact the wrong answer, even though what we actually want is explicit instruction in the text key vocabulary. So be careful. You can't just take all of these little tricks and rules as as foolproof. 47. Pause here. The correct answer is C, promoting their oral language development and listening comprehension, right? So you have to picture this activity and picture the students doing it. And it helps if you've seen it before. It's a common practice. So, right, the students have objects in their hands and they're describing to each other and they're trying to use all of their oral vocabulary, right? But here's the thing, a lot of the answers that are trying to trick you are talking about texts, right? Developing their ability to develop and categorize words according to their function. That could be, when I read that, I was kind of assuming text, but I suppose you could read that when it's not talking about text. But it can't be A. We're not doing shades of meaning of words with similar denotations. Oh, that one is definitely clearly it must be looking at text, right? D is developing oral presentation skills. While that's lovely, that is not connected to the objective of the activity, which is developing oral language. That's what this is trying to do. Develop oral language, develop listening comprehension so that you have more background knowledge to bring to the table when you are doing reading. 49. Pause here. The correct answer is A, words that are conceptually challenging. So this is an example of the test not using the phrase tier 2 vocabulary words, but this is in fact the definition of tier 2 vocabulary words. So when we're doing this unit on ecosystems, we want to teach the words that are going to be conceptually challenging for that student. All the other things about irregular words, multimeaning, syllable types, all that is decoding stuff, and we are in vocabulary land right now. We are trying to get them to understand, so we want to choose and teach the words that are preventing their understanding. Okay. Um, sentences and writing gets sort of short shrift throughout the MTEL. It gets kind of glommed on to different areas in places where it's confusing, and you might just be like, oh, I thought we were talking about this, and you have a couple questions in a row on phonics or something, and then boom, there's a sentence question. You're like, what's going on? Um, so it's certainly kind of, in terms of the MTEL, maybe a little bit of an afterthought. But I want to try to give you, just because the sentence level questions and the writing questions will be in there, but it's hard to know what's worth teaching. So I just want to give you the most basic, big, broadest sentence stuff without worrying too much of the details, because as we talked about in the very first introduction, if you come to a sentence question or two that is just like, I didn't cover, or you haven't seen covered before and you have no idea about it's okay. You have a bunch of questions that you can be comfortable punting, especially because when I show you in the last video how to do the essay, you're gonna kick butt in the essay and have a bunch of points in the bank from the essay. All right. So let's talk about what I want you to know in terms of sentences. So the test will use the vocabulary around types of sentences and clauses, and it's going to want you to distinguish between them. So we have two kinds of, at the basic level, we have simple sentences, which are made up of what are also known as independent clauses. So this is when we have a sentence that can stand by itself. It's a phrase in a sentence that can stand by itself. Okay. So if you take any sentence and it's just one phrase and it forms a complete sentence, that's a simple sentence, also known as an independent clause. Now, when we take multiple independent clause and we connect them with a conjunction, such as and, but, or, yet, etc., that makes a compound sentence, right? Um, so we can take two independent clauses and combine them together, and then that's called a compound sentence. Then we have this thing called dependent clauses, which is an idea in a phrase, but it can't stand on its own as a complete sentence. Um, so there's lots of ways that we can make sentences complex by combining both a dependent and an independent clause together, because they're all a sentence. For it to be a complete sentence, there has to be an independent clause in it somewhere, right? And this is, um, you know, noun, subject, verb, right? Subject, verb, noun, predicate. These things come together to make complex sentences as well. So let's just take a look at just one simple question that talks about these clauses and sentences and see if we can infer from just this very little information here the answer. Oh my goodness, I forgot. Before we look at the question, let's talk about an evidence-based strategy. So this is one of those strategies that it's easy to remember. So I wanted to teach it to you in case when you get to the essay, you're going to need to pull an evidence-based strategy. So sentence combining is the name of the evidence-based practice. And I strongly suggest you have this. What is sentence combining? Sentence combining is a practice that we use with students to help them develop their writing, and specifically helping them um, take two dependent clauses, two independent clauses or simple sentences, and combine them into one sentence, right? So here, let's take that work of that we were explaining here and look at it in practice, okay? So here's what sentence combining looks like. You have column one of sentences, column two of sentences, and what you want to do is take this sentence, the boy sat down, the boy ate supper, and I want you to combine them into one sentence. That's sentence combining, right? So you could do a very simple thing. We have this independent clause, this independent clause. Well, if I just wanted to make this compound, I stick a conjunction between them and boom, I have one compound sentence and I've combined them. The boy sat down and the boy ate supper. That's a legal sentence. It's has a lot of unnecessary words in it, but it's a legal sentence. The boy sat down and the boy ate supper. Compound combines two independent clauses with a conjunction. It works. Okay. Now, there are some clues that over here it's giving you. It's like, hey, if you want to make this more complex, use and, but only use boy once. So you can't say the boy sat down and the boy ate supper. Let's say the boy sat down and ate supper. Now, when we say the boy sat down and ate supper, now we have a complex sentence because the boy sat down is dependent, but ate supper is the boy sat down is independent. Ate supper is a dependent clause because it doesn't have a subject anymore. Um, so it begs the question, who ate, right? So this is a dependent clause. We've combined an independent clause with a dependent clause to make a complex sentence. This helps students writing. And obviously, the boy sat down and ate supper is how we would actually combine those, right? That's what we would want to say. And so we help students grow in their writing by explicitly teaching them how to take two independent clauses and combine them so that they can make more complex sentences, right? We don't want students trying to intuit this or figure it out on their own. We want to use sentence combining to teach it. And there's lots of examples on the slide. You can go ahead and look at these for more, but I think you should get the idea based on that. All right, now the question. Let's do one question talking about sentence structure. All right, number 51, pause here. The correct answer is B, deconstructing complex sentences into independent and dependent clauses. There is a lot of sentence and writing vocabulary in this between active and passive voice. You should know that distinguishing between complex sentences that use active and passive voice aren't really connected to students' ability to read and understand necessarily. That's more of a specific thing. Um, Identifying common transition words is a thing that we would do, but it's not going to um, it's not going to be tied to understanding complex sentence structure, right? What makes a sentence structure complex? It's complex because it's the joining of independent and dependent clauses. That is what a complex sentence is. So talking about the transition words, well, if you remember from the previous slide, that complex sentence, oh, it did have one it had an and. But sometimes complex sentences don't even have a transition word. They just have a comma or something that brings the dependent clause together with the independent clause. And lastly, distinguishing between demonstrative and indefinite pronouns in a sentence. Um, that is the thing you could teach, but it's not relevant to understanding complex sentence structure. The only answer is B, deconstructing complexes. So this is the opposite of sentence combining. So this isn't an evidence-based practice that I would necessarily you know, like label and use in an essay, but doing the opposite of sentence combining, where you take a complex sentence and then try to separate it, is also a good activity to do. And it kind of goes backwards. And this is more focused on helping reading versus sentence combining, which is helping students become better writers, which is what I was talking a lot about. This is more taking an already complex sentences and figuring out and pulling it apart to help reading. All right, that's enough for Objective 5. We covered quite a bit here.